As I always say, I'm grateful to serve in a congregation where people are old enough to realize that I can be forgetful as well.
Sometimes we wear too many hats. Scripture reading this morning is taken from the book of Luke, chapter 22, verses 66 through 71, and then in chapter 23, verse 25. When day came, the assembly of the elders, the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And all of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his lips." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed.
Some came to weep. Some came to mourn. Some came sinners. Some came reborn. That just doesn't describe the crowd that was at the foot of the cross on that terrible day. That could just as easily describe you and I and those of us who worship today. Some came surprised, some came dismayed, some came lonely, some came afraid. But he came forgiving. And that ultimately is the good news of Easter week. I want to tell you about a story I read that would really be funny, only it's too sad to be funny. A young soldier was fighting in the war in Italy during World War II. And he managed to jump into a foxhole just ahead of a spray of bullets that was coming in over his head. And he immediately attempted to dig down even deeper into the foxhole to get more protection. And he scraped as best he could to unearth the dirt with his hands. And he scraped, and as he was frantically scraping for the dirt, he felt somebody jump into the foxhole just behind him. And as he was digging, and before he turned around, he found a silver crucifix at the bottom of the foxhole. And he looked at it, and then he looked at the person who had jumped into the foxhole, and he noticed that he was a chaplain. And he said, "Oh, thank God, I'm glad you're here." He says, "Can you tell me how you work these things?" And he held up the crucifix. "Am I glad to see you? Can you tell me how to work this?" You see, I think that that's a pertinent question for many people today. How do you work these things? How do you work the cross? You see, we see crosses everywhere we go. We see crosses hung around people's necks. We see crosses adorning the walls of people's homes who do not necessarily even believe as we believe. We see crosses tattooed on people's arms, and we wonder if we all know, what does that mean? What does the cross really mean? Writer Flannery O'Connor writes that when she was young, her family would occasionally visit a nearby convent. And one of the sisters always came out, and she had a big cross hanging around her neck. And each time she would see Flannery, she would just give her a great big old hug. And then that cross that she was wearing around her neck would press itself against Flannery's cheek and make an impression on her cheek. At least that was one cross that you can say that really made an impression. Do you know that one of the few weekdays when there is no trading that takes place on the New York Stock Exchange is on Good Friday? And if you were to go to the information center there at the New York Stock Exchange and ask them, why do you close the doors on Good Friday? They would give you their stock answer. Since 1864, the Stock Exchange Board has voted each year to close on Good Friday for religious purposes. What does that mean? Does that have anything to do with the cross? They don't know. Is it out of respect for the cross? I doubt it. And I wonder about that, especially because just not too long ago, a federal judge implied he might go easy on two stockbrokers who were convicted of security fraud, and he might go easy for them because they happen to work in a culture of fraud. He was referring to the stock exchange as the culture of fraud. How can they work in a culture of corruption and still honor the cross? Is the question that the judge wants the lawyers to address in their sentencing hearing. Can you have a corrupt culture and still honor the cross? How can you stand by knowing that several thousand people are killed by violence each year in this country and not say anything, and at the same time say you honor the cross? Conversely, some churches are actually being constructed with no cross in sight that claim to be Christian churches. Can you preach Christ in all his fullness and all of his glory and not pay homage to the cross on which he died? It's troubling. Some people wear crosses who have absolutely no idea in the world of who Jesus is, who Jesus was, what he died for. And then you have others who build churches in his name but refuse to deal with his redeeming sacrifice. What should we say about the cross today? We all know the basic story of Jesus, a man of peace, a man of love, a man who healed the sick and even raised the dead. And even so, with all of that good, he had many, many enemies. He was a threat to the religious authorities as well as all the civil authorities. And there were many in his day who would not rest until he was crucified. And he went into the garden to pray, and according to one account, his agony was so great that as he prayed, his teardrops fell like big drops of blood. And let this cup pass from me, he prayed. He didn't want it to happen. And he asked his Father, let this cup pass from me, but your will be done. Then one of his disciples, named Judas, betrayed him. And he did it with a kiss. And he was taken before the authorities to be interrogated, tortured, and killed. Meanwhile, in an act of cowardice, his most trusted disciple, Simon Peter, betrayed him. He denied that he ever knew him. The Roman authorities broke every law known to them in his trial of Jesus. They tried him at night, which was totally illegal. They didn't care about justice. They didn't care about giving him a fair trial. All they wanted to do was get rid of him. And even though they couldn't find any wrong that he had done, they made him carry that cross up the hill to Golgotha, the place of the skull, where they drove nails in his hands and his feet, and they suspended him from that cross and left him to die. You know the basic story. Sure you do. What does it mean? Does it have any meaning to you this day? Well, I'll tell you one thing it means. It means, first of all, that you and I are loved. We are loved with an amazing love. There's a true story about a Marine recruit who went for training at Paris Island. And he was a little different from the other recruits. They thought he was kind of an oddball and a weirdo. And they picked on him because he was different from the rest of them. And the men in that barracks that he was assigned to were particularly cruel. And one day, one of them came up with an idea. Their idea of fun was to get a disarmed hand grenade and throw it out into the center of the floor at the barracks. And they were going to holler, "Get out, get out, it's a live grenade." And then they were going to stand back and watch this odd, weird recruit panic and flee. And then they would have a big laugh and a big joke out of it. Well, they did. They threw the grenade out. And they said, get out, it's a live grenade." But rather than going into panic and rather than running, this oddball recruit dove and he covered up the grenade. And he hollered, get out of here, all of you. You'll all be killed if you don't. It's a live grenade." You see, he thought truly it was a live grenade. And he stretched out his body over that grenade. He was willing to give his life to save the lives of his fellow recruits. In the same way, Jesus Christ was willing to throw his body on a live grenade to save you and to save me. Pastor Richard Fairchild who is a pastor of the United Christian Church of Christ in Canada. And he gives a similar analogy from one of the movies of the Superman series. The evil Lex Luthor launches a rocket missile which explodes near one of the California fault lines. And the resulting earthquakes that he causes by launching this rocket creates turmoil over a vast area of territory there in California. And as Superman is flying over the area to make a visual inspection of the damage, he sees a tragedy that is about to happen. The earthquakes have caused a 5-foot section of railroad to become twisted and torn out. And he sees this train loaded with passengers heading rapidly towards that section of missed railroad. And the engineer, even if he saw the damage ahead, doesn't have time to stop. So Superman swoops down and he stretches out his body over where the rails used to be, and it allows the train to go over Superman and save the people. Pastor Fairchild writes, Jesus performed a similar act of salvation. He too stretched out his body to save us. He stretched it out on the cross. And Fairchild goes on to say it's an interesting analogy, but it breaks down. Because everyone knows that Superman is invincible. Nothing can hurt Superman, and he is the man of steel. Jesus, however, was made of flesh, just like you and just like me. Yes, he was one nature with the Father, of course he was. But when he was born into this world, he emptied himself out, and he became completely as we are. He became vulnerable to abuse. He became vulnerable to pain. He became vulnerable to even death itself. And he did it willingly. And this is important, that you and I understand that the cross is not an accident of history. Jesus didn't die simply because he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't die simply because the authorities hated him. He died to show God's love for you and for me. In his suffering and in his death, Christ identified with all of us, with all of God's children. His death was not the result of decisions made by his friends or his enemies. He looked at all of them and he said, "You're not taking my life. I am giving it. I choose to lay my life down for you." He gave his life willingly that you and I might have life abundantly. There was an article in the National Geographic a few years ago of a young Pennsylvania man who was badly burned in an explosion. To save his life, physicians covered him with skin from a donor, as well as a piece of skin that they took from his own body that was a postage stamp size piece of skin. And they grafted all this other skin from the donor and that to cover his whole body and saved his life. And a journalist asked him later on, "Do you ever think about the donor who saved your life?" And the man answered, To be alive because of a dead donor is too big. It's too much. So no, I don't even think about it. On this day, when we focus on Christ's passion, his suffering, and his death on our behalf, it's time for us to think about what it means. It is not too big, too much to think about. You see, you and I are loved with an amazing love. Christ gave his life, and he gave it willingly that you and I might have life abundantly. In his suffering and in his death, Christ identified with all of us. And we must never, ever lose sight of the cross. Amen.